Good morning. Today we are going to talk about the history of the church and the things about the history that might be bothering you. This is lesson number 12 of the course, Avoiding a Faith Crisis, how to turn a faith crisis on any topic into a faith-building opportunity. When you have concerns and questions and doubts about church history, which we're going to be talking about today, your concern may be this: how can I accept the history of the church that has inconsistencies and disturbing events of the past? Well, here's the principle. Even though the history of the church has its sketchy, dark spots, the restored gospel of Jesus Christ is still the Lord's church on the earth. When studying church history, will you give each event a 360-degree look? Why is it important to study the history of the church? Marlin Jensen said, it is important that we become familiar with our church's history, especially with its founding stories, the oldest stories. These stories, Joseph Smith's first vision, the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, angelic visitations by John the Baptist, Peter, James, John, Elijah, Elias, and others, contain the foundational truths upon which the restoration is based. Truth number one: some of the history of the church is sad, messy, confusing, ugly, and unsavory. But that does not change the fact that Jesus is your Savior and that he restored the church, his church, through Joseph Smith. Number two, it is important to get the big picture of the church and not just bits and pieces. And I'm talking a big picture about the church history, whether it be contemporary or old. Compare church history to a puzzle. And this particular piece has a lot of pieces, over 100. This puzzle represents one event in church history, okay? And notice that there's a lot of pieces or facts to the big story. You got to be asking yourself what, when, who, why, how, and where. Because regarding some things in church history, you may know absolutely nothing. And so, you don't know anything, so it's not a concern to you. However, you may have heard about an event, and that is all you know. Something happened. That's all you know. Regarding some things in church history, you may know a little bit, stuff here and there, or you may know lots. But if you look at the puzzle, there are still pieces that are missing. Regarding the history of the church, you weren't there. So my advice is to give it a 360-degree look. When exploring a controversial piece of history, controversial to you, it's essential to ask thoughtful and open-ended questions to promote understanding and critical thinking. I want you to think through this. Just because you hear something, don't just take it at face value. Do your own homework on it. You will never know everything about church history. There will always be missing pieces to the story just because you were not there, and historians a lot of time take a certain slant on certain things when they're reporting the history. So my invitation is, will you continue to add to your puzzle about church history, especially on those things that cause you grief or consternation? So I'm going to give you a hint, 5 keys for evaluating church history. Number one, was it a primary account? For example, the question you want to ask is this: was the account produced by the participant or an actual observer? Okay, very, very important. Was this account produced, written by, recorded by a participant or an actual observer? We go to the account of the first vision. There's Joseph Smith seeing God the Father and his son, Jesus Christ. That's a primary account. Joseph Smith was there, but he told it to people and they started telling stories. And by the time it got down to the second, third, fourth level, sometimes the facts would change. So if you want to know what really happened, then you go back up to Joseph Smith. Number two is, how does this account harmonize with other accounts? How does it compare to other historical records? Are the dates and facts and details and claims consistent with other sources? Now, if we go back to the primary account and the harmony account, Joseph Smith told the first vision story multiple times over a several-year period, but his account harmonized with each other. New facts were added each time he talked, and it became a whole complete picture, but it was in total harmony the whole time. In the preface to the 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith wrote, "I would inform you that I translated the Book of Mormon, by the gift and power of God." Now, when Joseph was pressed for specifics about the process of translation, Joseph repeated on several occasions that it had been done by the gift and power of God, and once added, and I'm quoting Joseph, it was not intended to tell the world all the particulars of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. When Joseph did describe the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, it's harmonized with all the previous times that he described the process of doing the Book of Mormon. Number 3, contemporary. How soon after the event was the account recorded? Have details been lost or confounded as time passes? Have the facts changed because of time or interpretation? Look at your own life. You tell an incredible event about your life, and as you get older, the story embellishes. It gets better and better. So you want to get contemporary, as close to the event as possible. Number 4, objective. Is the author or the source of this event free from bias? Has the source consciously or unconsciously inserted their views into this event? Is any historical event objective? That's a good question, isn't it? Is it objective? Probably not. Number 5, the last thing you want to look at is other evidence. Is there additional information or sources that tend to confirm this account? Is there other evidence, or does it appear to be hearsay, conjecture, subjective opinion, or blatantly false information? If you have other evidence, it helps make the story legitimate. Quick story. This is my aunt, my great aunt, Juanita Brooks, who wrote a book back in 1950 called The Mountain Meadows Massacre. She did a ton of homework. This is, of course, before the internet. She would drive her car to Southern California to the Huntington Library and other places and get information. She wrote a landmark book in 1950. I'm very proud of my aunt for doing this, because the Mountain Meadows Massacre was a dark stain in the history of the church. Well, of course, she's passed on by now, but there are other books about this and articles, and now there are several books. In fact, the 2 bottom ones, The Massacre at Mountain Meadows and Vengeance is Mine, those are really accurate because they've come up with new information. So, quick review on looking at 5 things. Is it a primary account written by the original author? Does it harmonize with other accounts? Is it contemporary? Is it close to the date that it happened as possible? Is it objective? Very hard to be, right? And is there other evidence, like the example I gave with my great aunt Juanita Brooks? Since she wrote the book in 1950, there's a lot more other evidence that has come out, which adds to her story. And she was very accurate, by the way. So let's do a case study. This is a real question that somebody asked one time. Did God the Father touch Joseph Smith's eyes during the first vision? Have you ever heard that question? People think that happened, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. Let's suppose, for example, you heard someone claim that in the spring of 1820, God the Father touched Joseph Smith's eyes during the first vision. Is that accurate? I've never heard of it until I did my homework on this. Did you realize that there was actually a historical source that would attempt to argue yes? And let me tell you that story. In 1893, a Latter-day Saint named Charles Walker attended a testimony meeting at which one of the local elders, a man named John Alger, bore his testimony. Okay, so a lot of people in the audience. Charles Walker's paying attention. Charles Walker's paying attention, and John Alger talks. And this is what he said. Walker recorded, the guy who was in the audience, that Alger testified that as a teenager, he heard Joseph Smith state that during the first vision, God touched his eyes with his finger and said, "Joseph, this is my beloved son." As soon as the Lord had touched his eyes with his finger, he immediately saw the Savior. Now, keep in mind, Charles Walker heard this in the audience when John Alger was speaking. At the close of the meeting, Walker, who was sitting in the audience, and others questioned the speaker. Walker recorded in his journal that day, he, Alger, told us at the bottom of the meeting house steps that he was in the house of Father Smith in Kirtland when Joseph made this declaration, and that Joseph, while speaking of it, put his finger to his right eye, suiting the action with the words so as to illustrate and at the same time impress the occurrence on the minds of those unto whom he was speaking. Interesting. Getting interesting, isn't it, the story? So after hearing that account, and that's all the information you have, ask yourself, is that what really happened? And number 2, would I, Peter, be willing to teach that God touched the Joseph Smith's eyes during the first vision, like in a talk or a lesson or a sacrament meeting or something like that? Think about it. I want you to do some deep thinking on this. Do you have enough evidence that that was truly a fact? Now, remember the 5 things that you want to ask: primary, harmony, contemporary, objective, other evidence. I have given you on the handout this week keys to evaluating church history. And if you notice, I got the question on the left, but I have 3 boxes: green, yellow, or red. Green is, it's probably true. I have minor or no concerns about what I just heard. Yellow, I have moderate concerns, and red, I have significant concerns. And you want to list the reasons to the right. So, number 1, was this a primary account? Big concerns. This was a third-hand account. Remember, he was in the audience hearing it from Charles Alder, who heard it from somebody else. Charles Walker is reporting what he heard John Alder say that he heard Joseph Smith may have said. Okay. Number 2, how does this account harmonize with other accounts? Is it in harmony? Alder's claim that the Father and the Son appeared to Joseph Smith and that God appeared first, saying, "This is my beloved Son," are consistent with other first vision sources. Joseph Smith said that. He was a primary source. But his unique claim that God touched Joseph's eyes is not reported in any other of the 9 contemporary accounts of the first vision given by Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith never mentioned that his eyes were touched. And I think that'd be kind of an important thing for Joseph to mention. Number 3, contemporary. How soon after the event was this event recorded? Important point. Charles Walker was sitting in the audience 60 years after the first vision when John Alder reported this in 1893. Okay, so it wasn't contemporary. It was 60 years. It was my age plus a few more years. I mean, it was just not contemporary at all. Objective. Is the author of this source of event free from bias? There is some potential for bias here, given that John Alder may be playing to a Utah crowd who didn't know Joseph Smith personally, but his language is not critical and his relation of the event is straightforward. So there's moderate concerns here. What was John Alder's intent? What was his objective for saying that in a sacrament meeting? And number 5, is there other evidence that suggests that this happened? Evidence suggests Alder lived in Kirtland at the time of Joseph Smith did. That's true. But other than his own claim or scriptural precedent, such as God touching Enoch's eyes, there is no other documentary evidence to support this assertion. And so that's a yellow, probably a red, that there's really not too much other evidence. So the summary of all this, since you're a critical thinker and you're looking at church history with a 360-degree view, overall, while it seems likely that Alder could have heard Joseph Smith relate the first vision, we would not consider Alder's assertion that God touched Joseph Smith's eyes as being highly reliable, placing most of our marks in the yellow and the red categories of moderate or significant concern. So this is what your sheet would look like. Nothing was in the green. Now, Joseph would have said this. It would have been in the green, but this is all yellow and red. So no, God did not touch Joseph Smith's eyes. Joseph Smith never said it. And John Alder, we don't know why he said it or made it up or whatever. So that's the lesson today. Now you got to do something, okay? Your assignment, step 1 of 2. In your study journal, list some events, the history of the church, list some of the events in the history of the church that either bother you or you do not know much about, okay? And I gave you one, Mountain Meadows Massacre. That's an interesting one to study. Now, regarding church history, you may be thinking, this is horrible. Why would the Lord allow this to take place? You're kidding me. This really happened? You know, what in the heck were they thinking at the time? Doesn't this event give the church a permanent black eye? Doesn't this historical thing disprove the validity of the church? Isn't this event embarrassing to the church? Well, now you got to be a detective, okay? Step 2 of 2. You've chosen your event. Choose one topic, do your homework, and come to your own conclusions. You got to do your own homework on this. You just don't want to rely on guys like me to tell you that yeah, it happened or it didn't happen. Yeah, every organization, every person has a history that needs to be looked into. So that is your assignment this week, is to choose an event, look into it, and I'd love you to email me and tell me what you found. And I will see you next week. Thank you very much.